So, the cherry orchard. Um, what do I need to tell you so that you can, so that as you sit down to read it, it won't just be baffling. Um, there are a few things about one thing to keep in mind. This play was first produced in 1904, and in a lot of ways, it represented a different kind of drama. Um, for one thing, there's no obvious central character. It's not clearly one person's story, the way Oedipus the King is Oedipus's story, or the way Death of a Salesman is Willy Loman's story. Those, other characters matter in those. I mean, Biff matters a lot in Death of a Salesman. Jocasta matters a lot in Oedipus. But still, those stories belong to a central character, a central protagonist, as they say, a main character. This play, you're going to have to decide who you think the central character is. I would vote for Lyubov as being more central than anyone else, but still, it's a near thing. It's not obvious. What Chekhov tends to do is write what they call an ensemble piece, where it's about a lot of people. It's not a lot of people arranging themselves around a main person. So that it has its advantages and its disadvantages for a drama. You don't necessarily get the same intensification as you do watching what happens to one person who we can kind of identify with, or at least sort of stare at and feel the world through what happens to him or her. Instead, you are getting lots of different stories intertwining. And I think that has to do with Chekhov's temperament. But you know what? I'll come back to that. Okay, so one thing that's different about this play is the sense of it as an ensemble piece, that you're not quite sure where the center is. It's not obvious where the center is. Okay. Let me also, Chekhov said something odd about this play, something that most readers have found really odd, and something his initial director, who was Stanislavski, the father of modern acting, really. Stanislavski directed the first production of this play, and Stanislavski didn't follow what Chekhov said. Chekhov considered this play a comedy. And that might seem very strange to you after you read it, because it seems so sad. Okay, what goes on in here there seems to be a lot of tragedy, or at least a lot of what they call pathos. The word pathetic comes from pathos. Pathos is, this sort of sadness. It's just, you go, oh, that's terrible, to people who are involved in something pathetic, okay? Something pitiable, okay? And there seems a lot of reason to pity people in this play. So it's not what we normally think of as a comedy. And Stanislavski didn't direct it as a comedy. I think Tom Stoppard, the translator, kind of plays up the comic elements. One thing you might notice is that a bunch of the characters, excluding the minor characters, seem to be sort of like comic relief. I mean, you've got Charlotta, the governess, doing her magic tricks, and you've got Catastrophe Corner, who something bad always happens to no matter what, and you've got figures like that who are a little bit cartoonish. You've got the old man mumbling to himself. Whether that's funny or not, I don't know. It depends. So Stoppard, I think, who is a modern playwright who's among other things is primarily a kind of comedian of ideas, played that side of it up. But most productions haven't. Most productions have treated this as a tragedy. So why Chekhov, who was no dummy and who was very attuned to other people, it's not like he was so headstrong that he could only see what he felt. And yet Chekhov called it a comedy. It's very odd. I think one of the things to understand about this play, and maybe this goes back to why Chekhov writes ensemble pieces. For Chekhov, everybody's got their own story, and he can't bear to amputate those and just give all of the stage to one person. I think that he is among the gentlest and kindest of literary geniuses. That, as a group, literary geniuses tended to be difficult company, and a lot of them were kind of SOBs in at least some sense. Chekhov, nobody had a bad word to say about him. He was the nicest guy under the sun. He died young. He died in his early 40s of tuberculosis. He was also a doctor. He studied to be a doctor, and while he was in medical school, he had this large impoverished family, and not his own kids, but his brothers and sisters and parents and folks like that. And he started writing pieces for the newspaper that caught on. And he initially was writing for money, and it caught on, and his ambitions as a writer sort of deepened. But he never stopped thinking of himself as a doctor too. And when there was a really bad epidemic in Russia, a cholera epidemic, I think it was, he went out to volunteer his services. He was serious about being a doctor, and he was evidently an exceptionally giving, sweet, empathetic, simpatico person. And the way I think that shows up in the writing is that each of these people, including the really silly ones, the really foolish ones, there are a lot of foolish characters in Chekhov, and yet he treats them with great tenderness. He's very aware of their foolishness. At the same time, he's very compassionate towards them. So what you tend to get in Chekhov is a lot of characters who each get their own moment to be themselves and to assert their selfness, and who also nobody's perfect in these plays. Nobody's really heroic, and nobody's really villainous. They're all just different varieties of flawed, and yet in their own way have their own kind of beauty, or at least their own kind of integrity, their own humanity. These people are very human. Okay. So those are a couple of things to keep in mind. When you're looking for the main character, don't be surprised if it's a little tricky. However, there are three characters I would say are more central than any others. And that's Lyubov, who's the mother of the family, who has just returned to Russia from being abroad. There is Lopukhin, who you see on stage at the very beginning, who's a businessman, an old friend of the family, sort of, and also, well, I'll say a little more about that in a second. And there's Trofimov, who shows up relatively late, who used to be the tutor to Lyubov's son, their little boy who died at the age of 8, drowned in the river. It's a tragedy. It's one of the things that threw Lyubov away from her country, one reason she left Russia for a while. And so Lyubov, Lopukhin, and Trofimov, I think, have a certain prominence because I do think they represent something. They're very much themselves. They're not just mouthpieces, but they also do represent something. And to understand that, I think you need to know a little bit about Russia in 1904. Communism hadn't happened yet. The Russian Revolution happened 15 years later. Russia was ruled by the czars, and it was every Russian worried like crazy about what was happening to Russia. There was a sense the country was a mess and nobody knew how to fix it. You get that for several decades. You get that from every Russian writer, and they had some very great writers in those times. Some of the best that have ever walked the earth. And they couldn't get modern. Was one of the things. They saw Britain and France and Germany and the United States and these modern, well-educated countries where things seemed to function, and instead they were like this backward dictatorship. The peasants, there's a huge number of poor people living in squalor and a few rich, westernized, well-educated people. It's sort of the way you might think of a nation like India, though India is emerging from its place. But if you think of the way India has been traditionally for the last 50 years, a few people who are very much on a par with the privileged classes in the West, and then this huge impoverished peasantry who could be living in a 4 centuries ago. Okay, and the government was despotic and brutal at times, and it was just a big mess. And one of the things, and this is one reason why you got the Russian Revolution eventually, the thing with these three characters, Karl Marx was the father of communism, and he eventually and communism is what eventually won out in Russia after the Russian Revolution. It fell again 70 years later, but for about 70 years, Marx's ideas ruled Russia. And one of Marx's ideas was the idea that societies go through stages of how they organize themselves. And he says civilizations start to emerge with feudalism, where it's all about who owns the land, and little people work the land, and the rich landowners kind of stand above them as their feudal lords and demand their loyalty. And that is a system that applied in Europe and a lot of other places as well for many centuries, feudalism. And that's when an agricultural society tends to move to that. He said then there's capitalism, which tends to come along when things industrialize. And so the people who matter are not the big landowners, but businessmen. Investors, people who have been able to accumulate a bunch of capital, make investments, and become wealthy that way, and so they become the dominant class. And then the third stage that Marx thought was going to happen was socialism, where the capitalists are overthrown, and the working people take ownership of what he called the means of production, of all the ways that society can make money, which includes land, but it also includes things like factories and roads and everything else that produces wealth. So he says you start at feudalism. A society starts at feudalism, moves to capitalism, and then ends up at socialism, which he thought was the ideal form, and then the problems of society would be over. So that last part, the optimism of that last part hasn't been very well borne out by history, but those were the ideas before communism happened. And the reason I'm telling you that is because in this play, you have a feudal family, which is Lyubov and her brother Gaev and the great landowners. And you have a capitalist, you have Lopukhin, who's a successful businessman. And you also have Trofimov, who speaks up for political change and really, I think, is basically a socialist revolutionary. That when he talks about the great things that will come, that was the way a Marxist would talk in 1904. I don't think he necessarily wanted things to turn out the way they turned out under Joseph Stalin in Russia. I don't think Trofimov was brutal that way. But he represents that socialist stage. So the interplay between those three people, I think, they are human beings. They're not two-dimensional. They're not just mouthpieces. But they also do speak up for a certain kind of power, a certain kind of power base. Okay, feudalism, capitalism, socialism. That's something to keep in mind. One other thing that had happened in Russia was, and this you see in the old servant furs. In the 1860s, Russia abolished serfdom, which was essentially a form of slavery, where the peasants, everybody was white. It wasn't African slavery. It wasn't people of a different race being enslaved. But they were all Russians. But basically, what we would call peasants were owned. The great landowners owned their peasants. And those folks couldn't leave and go get another job unless the landowner thought it was all right. So Russia basically had slavery until it only abolished it around the same time as the United States did. And actually something like 80% of Russians or 85% of Russians were serfs. And then in the 1860s, the Tsar freed the serfs. And Furs is one of those freed serfs. And Lopukhin's father and grandfather were serfs. So Lopukhin is descended from slaves. And Furs was a slave himself and thinks that the end of serfdom, the end of slavery, was a disaster. And you might say, what? You get freed from slavery and you think it's a disaster? But if you think about it, if you grow up to be a slave or a serf, you're used to people making all your decisions for you, taking care of you. You don't have to run your own life. And unless you're brought up to run your own life, it's a very hard thing to do. So Furs, at one point he says, in the old days, the slaves belonged to the masters and the masters belonged to the slaves, which is kind of how it tends to work in a system of slavery. The masters are dependent on the slaves. The slaves are obviously under the thumb of the masters, and there's this weird kind of power balance, even though terrible things can happen to slaves. because they don't get the full protections of human beings. They also have a funny kind of power because they do all the work. So furs liked it better when everybody knew their place, essentially, including him. And Lopakin is the first free man in his family. And the kinds of feelings and ambitions that would generate in you matter to understanding that character. And by the way, Chekhov was also the son and grandson of serfs. He could relate to that. All right, so that's a bunch of, and this is getting a little long, so I'm going to draw it to a close. I'll just end on one other thing that's worth understanding about Chekhov. He made another remark. He said, people can be sitting around eating their dinner, saying nothing in particular, saying the most banal commonplaces, chatting over dinner, and the entire course of their life can be determined. He was fascinated by how that could happen. Because if you think, for instance, you'll see there's a scene in Act 4 in which people think one character is going to propose to another character. And they're alone in a room. And they talk about the weather. And then there's these long, awkward pauses. And then somebody gets called away. And they're never going to get married. And if you think about your own romantic history, you can probably think of times that the two of you sitting there, and you're sitting on the sofa, and it's just the two of you. And okay, let's from a female point of view. So you're the girl, and you like this guy, and you're sitting there, and there you are, and there's this pause, and it starts to get awkward because how far are you away from each other on the sofa? Not super far, not super close, and you're not. And he says, "So you want a soda?" And he jumps up and he goes to get you a soda. And that's when you know he's not going to kiss you. Right? You've probably lived that experience on one side or the other. And nobody ever says anything about it because you wouldn't. It's too embarrassing and you don't want to humiliate anyone. But it's something that doesn't happen. That somebody finds an excuse not to have happen. It can be a pivotal moment in someone's life. Chekhov was fascinated by that it's not only the things that are said that are dramatic, it's things that aren't said. And that we wait to hear said and never get to hear. That's part of what he was interested in dramatizing, the stuff that doesn't get said. Okay, take care.